Al-Baghdadi is sort of an outlier. He has a PhD in Islamic studies from actually it's called Saddam Hussein University, believe it or not. And the only way he could enroll in that program is if his family had Ba'ath Party connections. So, I mean, this is the thing. A lot of people join the Ba'ath Party not because they were true card-carrying ideologues. And, one of the stupider things the United States did after, of course, invading Iraq was the de-Baathification of the first three tiers of the party. So a lot of people, engineers, doctors, professionals who had joined up just so they could get ahead in life and make a living, were rendered unemployed. With Baghdadi, he is an absolute true believer, by all accounts. He actually does think that the armies of Rome will clash with the armies of Islam in Dabik, which is a town in Aleppo province. This is the great sort of Chiliastic conspiracy that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had put forward. And with Zarqawi, it was always about bleeding into Syria. So that goal has been achieved. But, I absolutely agree with you. Look, life is complicated and messy. And even people who, purport to espouse a totalist or pure ideology often have contradictory or alternative modes of thinking or systems of belief creeping in. So again, I don't know. I mean, are these Baathists, are they quote unquote secular or apostate? Not necessarily. They can have been radicalized or salafized under the faith campaign, or even just, by the sheer brutality and chaos of living in Iraq, both pre and post Saddam. But I think it is one of the more fascinating issues of looking at ISIS. And look, I mean, I'm an atheist like you, and our dearly departed friend Christopher Hitchens used to say that religion was just another form of totalitarianism. I think that was the driving force behind his critique of it, is that, he had in some ways gone through it himself as a believing Marxist and Trotskyist. Raymond Aron called Marxism a Christian heresy. There are a lot of similarities, and this is why, by the way, you find people who come from, secular or temporal ideologies essentially swapping one, totalitarianism for another, and taking up, some extreme form of religion or not so extreme form of religion. In fact, one of the leading evangelical Christians in the United States discovered Jesus in a Moscow hotel room when he found a stray Bible. Marvin Olasky is his name.
Right.
He's actually Jewish, a Jewish Marxist who became an evangelical Christian. So things like that happen all the time. And this is not an attempt to embarrass. I mean, I am a great admirer of your work and a co-thinker. So it's not an attempt to embarrass it. It is an attempt, though, to try and fully understand. And again, I want to show that ISIS does not exist in this vacuum of fundamentalism. It has state sponsors, or I should say not sponsors, but state accomplices. I mean, to this day, it's running all of Syria's natural gas industry and selling that natural gas back to Damascus, which claims to be at war with it. Mm-hmm. It runs most of the oil wells in eastern Syria and is selling oil not only to Free Syrian Army groups, but also back to Damascus and to smugglers in Turkey and Iraqi Kurds. I mentioned Russia, and the reason I do is people think Vladimir Putin is this great counterterrorist, right? I mean, he hates Islamic radicalism, and he went to war in Syria to destroy ISIS. Well, no. I mean, if you look at the metrics, 10%, according to the Pentagon spokesman Steve Warren, 10% of Russia's sorties have been going after ISIS. Now, the rest have been going after groups that range from nationalists to Islamists to jihadists, including the al-Qaeda franchise. But, with Putin, the goal, I think, is quite simple. It's exactly what Assad and the Iranians' goal has been from the beginning: deprive the West of any attractive, credible alternative to the dictatorship in Damascus, and make it a stark choice of the Takfiris on the one hand, or this secular war criminal on the other. And that's not really a choice, because no one in the West, as much as they may loathe Bashar al-Assad and hold him responsible, as well they should, for the destruction of the country, they don't think he's going to be flying planes into buildings in New York or Washington, D.C. ISIS would if it could. And one of the real challenges, Sam, is ISIS has broken apart or cleaved away from al-Qaeda. And I keep saying that, we're now at a more dangerous point than we were right after 9/11, because the way that al-Qaeda is going to compete with ISIS is through blood and fire and terror. And that's going to play out on the streets of Europe. It already has. It's playing out in Turkey, which has suffered more ISIS attacks than any other country. So that's a NATO member. And eventually it's going to come here. I mean, arguably it did with San Bernardino, although that was a case of people being inspired by rather than being trained up and dispatched as operatives. But yeah, this is, we have underestimated them. At the same time, we have, I think, sensationalized them and treated them as this apocalyptic bogeyman, when in fact there is a pragmatic component to what they're doing. I mean, the way that they've managed to take terrain, it's not because they're great fighters. I did this long interview with a defector from one of their security services who told me they fight like lemmings going off a cliff. I mean, it's just sort of a human wave of cannon fodder, particularly when they go up against the Kurds in Syria. What they're good at is tradecraft, and also they understand the sociology of the region. So where they have imposed their caliphate, what I call the briar patch of ISIS, is the Euphrates River Valley, mostly eastern Syria, western Iraq, the villages and hamlets and townships along that sort of continuum. And these are areas that are occupied by Arab tribes, and which are essentially confederations of families that span across borders. Remember, ISIS is dedicated to the dismantling of Sykes-Picot, the artificial states that have cobbled up after World War I. Well, to some extent, they have a lot to work with there, because the families and the constituents of ISIS are fanned across the region. I mean, you've got tribes in Iraq that are also in Saudi Arabia or in Kuwait or the UAE and so on. And the tribes have lived for hundreds of years through a very simple human political calculation. Whoever is the master, you cut a deal with. And that master could be Bashar al-Assad, or before him Hafez al-Assad, or it could be Saddam Hussein, it could be the American occupying force of Iraq, or it could be ISIS. And it was just about how do we get our daily bread and how do we subsist? The tribes have gray and black market economies. They need to make money. They need to be able to smuggle their goods and wares, and so on and so forth. And the way that ISIS's predecessor, al-Qaeda, was booted out of most of Iraq was so overweening and so brutal that the tribes, they didn't like the Americans, but they at least saw the Americans as a credible non-sectarian intercessory force that they could partner with to expel the Takfiris. Well, today, there is no credible non-sectarian force, because in Iraq, you have either ISIS or, let's be honest, Shia militia groups, which in many cases are as bad as ISIS and are driven by the same kind of apocalyptic zeal. It's only from a different sect of Islam, backed by Iran. Well, if you're a Sunni tribesman, you see these guys as, pogromists. They're going to come in and they might expel ISIS, but then they're going to burn your house down, and they're going to take your son as a so-called collaborator and throw him into a dungeon and take a power drill and stick it into his head. There's a misconception that the Syrian revolution started when a dozen kids scrawled on the walls in Deraa, but actually the earliest protests were registered in Damascus itself, in the old city. So, in the very capital, in the heart of Assad's regime. And what struck me is, we had seen in Egypt, to a lesser degree in Tunisia, although we can probably get into some of that, particularly how the media has covered groups like Ennahda. But we saw sort of the late failure of radical hopes. Teenagers turning out on the streets of Tahrir Square, protesting a pretty vicious authoritarian dictatorship. And then, it gets hijacked by religious extremists, or as they were depicted in the West, so-called moderate Islamists.
So now, Michael, you're talking about what happened during the so-called Arab Spring?
Right. And in Syria, what I was struck by was, the people who were leading this uprising, I mean, they really were small d Democrats. And, they had various views on which kind of country they wanted to model a future post-Assad Syria on. Some said like Turkey, others said like Tunisia, many said like the United States or like France. But one of the things that bothers me, and one of the reasons I wrote this book on ISIS, was to try and sort of turn back the clock to the very beginning. Because for a lot of people, history began when ISIS stormed into Mosul in 2014. And essentially this was always a jihadist insurgency. It was always being led by al-Qaeda and other assorted elements. And one of the things that I'm most interested in my work is the relationship between terror and state actors. And this is something that is just characteristic of the region. and it even goes beyond the region now. I mean, I've done a lot of work on Russia's facilitation of jihadism, beginning in Chechnya, but also, leading up to the Syria conflict. I mean, they've been sending jihadists into Syria because better they blow stuff up in Aleppo or in Raqqa than they do in Dagestan. And all of this gets elided in the way that the West tends to cover these things. But anyway, Assad's relationship with the very element that now claims to be trying to overthrow his regime and establish an Islamic state, I find fascinating. So one of the leitmotifs of our book, and I've co-wrote it with a Syrian national called Hassan, is to kind of, dredge up some of this occluded history of the way not only the Syrian government, but also the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein was, if not necessarily a catalyst, then at least an underwriter of much of the unpleasantness we're seeing now. People forget, and it is true the Bush administration misrepresented and lied about a lot of the intelligence in terms of Saddam's relationship with jihadi groups such as al-Qaeda, but it is also the case. After the invasion of Kuwait in the first Gulf War, he inaugurated something called the Islamic Faith Campaign, which was an attempt to marry the Ba'ath ideology with Salafism. And the reason for this was he saw the greatest threat to his regime. Well, there were two. One was from Iran next door, with whom he had waged a brutal 8-year war. And the other was internally from Islamist elements, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. So one of the unintended consequences of the faith campaign was people abandoned the Baathism and took up the Salafism. And a lot of these elements have wound up, or they did wind up in the so-called anti-American and anti-Iraqi insurgency from 2003 onwards. But now, funnily enough, a lot of these former regime elements are in the upper echelons of ISIS. You're looking at lieutenant colonels in the Iraqi army or agents of the Mukhabarat intelligence services. And some of the leading operatives, including those who constructed the ISIS franchise in northern Syria in 2013, they behaved very much like state-trained, almost Stasi-like intelligence operatives. So this is something I think, that needs to get addressed. And this is not by any means, and I'm sure you want to talk about this, not to undermine or dismiss the element and the currents of Islamic fundamentalism that run throughout ISIS. It's very much a prominent factor, particularly amongst the so-called foreign fighters or the mujahideen coming around from around the world who think they're going to usher in the apocalypse. My thesis is, at the very high level, we're being asked to presume that people who, as of 2002 or even early 2003, were drinking wine, wearing military fatigues with epaulets they had never earned, keeping their 12 mistresses and their 8 mansions scattered throughout the state of Iraq. That as of today, now that they've got the long black beard and the dishdasha, they really want to usher in the end times? Or is there perhaps a political project that's underlying much of what ISIS is doing? And I think that's something that needs greater discussion. And it's indeed, one of the sort of mainstays of my work is to try and figure out, where the messianic or eschatological element ends and where the political, literal state building begins. IHS, which is a British defense firm, reckons that ISIS has lost 14% of its territory across Syria and Iraq in 18 months. 14% of territory is not that much, but it is significant in the sense that they have been pushed out of large quadrants of northern Syria by the Kurds. They have lost some significant terrain, such as Ramadi, which is a provincial capital of Anbar province that they had claimed in last May. But what this does not account for is where else they have taken territory. So for instance, ISIS has what's known as wilayats, which is the Arabic word for province. These are essentially affiliate organizations that predate ISIS allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the organization. So Boko Haram, the Nigerian terrorist outfit in West Africa, has pledged allegiance to ISIS. With the stroke of a pen, one could argue, ISIS gained 20,000 square miles of territory in West Africa with that pledge of allegiance. Now, does that mean that they have absolute control or, the kind of terrain governance capability that they do in Syria and Iraq? No. But it does mean that they have people who are fired by their ideology and willing to die on their behalf. They have done similarly in Libya, which is now considered both a way station for foreign fighters who can't make the journey into Syria and Iraq, and also, depending on who you ask, a fallback base in the event that Mosul or Raqqa should fall. And they're doing this since Sinai, the outfit that took down the Metrojet airliner, or, Russian commercial plane, killing over 200 people. That Wilayat Sinai is essentially a colonial outpost, if you like, of ISIS. So that aspect of their international project really can't be discounted. By the way, their presence in Libya puts them about less than 500 miles away from the coast of Sicily. So you remember, I mean, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi says, if we're lucky, inshallah, we'll conquer Rome. Well, they're not going to conquer Rome, and I don't think even the top ISIS guys believe that. But they can certainly come close enough to Europe, and as we know, and as we've seen in Paris and elsewhere, they're already in Europe with their sleeper cells and their sort of covert operatives, the invisible armies, as I like to call them. And this is the thing, and Sam, here is where absolutely religion plays a paramount role, and what worries me the most. ISIS, if you're Baghdadi or if you're in his Shura Council, you go to bed at night in Raqqa or Mosul or wherever you're hiding, and you know that you might wake up tomorrow and some guy you've never heard of, who could have been living in his mother's basement in Albuquerque, might take an AK-47 and shoot up a school and do it in the name of your organization. The remote radicalization project, the ISIS-inspired attack, that I think is going to be their stock and trade for acts of terrorism abroad. Because, people look to an organization that seems to be successful. Doesn't matter how in fact, the ultra-violence works in its favor. For any kind of loser, lunatic element living in any part of the world, really, their state building. The reason that this has to be successful for them is because it has to inspire people to join their ranks. If they're seen to be on the decline or on the back foot, they're not going to inspire as many operatives. So look, they've taken a battering. I know there's a very complicated answer to a pretty simple question, but welcome to the Middle East.
Yeah, no, it's good.
They've taken a battering, but they've shown a remarkable degree of resilience. And I mean, as I'm talking to you, I just finished an epilogue to the second edition of our book, where we've interviewed people living in Deir Zur and, again, the Euphrates River Valley, which is their strategic heartland. And people there say, look, I don't like ISIS, but I have no alternative. In fact, because of U.S. airstrikes and the coalition bombardment, the way I made a living has now been rendered obsolete. So I am sending my youngest son to join ISIS because at least he'll get a salary. ISIS pays like $400 a month to its fighters. And not only do they pay the fighter a salary, but they pay subsidies for the family members of that fighter. So, if I were to join ISIS, I'd get $400 a month. My wife would get $200. And my 10-month-old daughter, I'd get money to pay for her baby food. So again, this is their hearts and minds approach. It's very sophisticated and it's been very successful. And they've lost money in the sense that the oil infrastructure has been pretty depleted. Although, and again, another Western misconception, they don't make most of their money from oil sales. I don't know where this myth came from, but it's a dangerous one. They actually make most of their money through running a petty bureaucracy of taxation and surcharging. The reason they want territory, well, one of the reasons they want it is with territory comes people, and with people comes the ability to charge, if they're Muslim, zakat, if they're non-Muslim, jizya, which is an Islamic tax. And not only that, like if you're caught smoking cigarettes, ISIS will throw you in a cage for 3 days, but they'll also charge you money, charge you $1,000. You have to pay a fine. If you're seen to be a member of a rival organization or any kind of dissident or resistance fighter to ISIS, if you flee a territory that they control, they'll take your house. So, it's jihadist eminent domain. They'll take your house, they'll take your property, all of your assets. If you run a business, they'll take your business and all of its inventory. So they run a mafia-style state in addition to a terroristic one.